When I'm trying to evaluate an inverse trig expression, the first question I'm going to ask myself is x, or the side ratio they give me, is it within the domain for that particular function? So we can see the domain for both inverse sine and inverse cosine is everything from -1 to 1, and the domain of inverse tangent is everything from negative to positive infinity. So in other words, inverse tangent will always work, we'll always be able to get an answer. Sine or cosine inverse, we may be undefined. And what we'll do in this video is we're going to start with working with when x, the number in parentheses, the side ratio, is a positive value or 0. These are the really easy ones because all we're going to do, regardless of what specific function we have, we're just going to look the value up in the chart as long as that value is not undefined. So let's go ahead and start with those as our easy examples. So again, that first question I'm going to ask myself is this value within the domain of that function? And as we just said, the domain of inverse tangent is from -infinity to positive infinity, so everything is going to work. And as long as that value is positive, it's simply a matter of looking this up in our trig chart. So the way we'll do this is, since I'm dealing with inverse tangent, I'm going to look down the tangent column until I find that value. I see 1 is right there. I'm going to read backwards across then to find the angle that would get me a tangent of 1. And I see that that's going to be pi over 4. We're going to stick with using radians for this, so I'll go ahead, let me erase those. My answer for this then is just pi over 4. That's the angle that's going to get me a tangent of 1. Okay, so again, these ones are pretty easy. Inverse cosine of 1/2. Recall that for inverse cosine and inverse sine, my domain is all the numbers between -1 and 1. So yes, 1/2 is in between -1 and 1. So if I go and look at my chart, I can see that in the cosine column there's 1/2. If I read that backwards to find my angle, it looks like it's pi over 3 as the angle that I want to have. So I'll go ahead and jot that down. And then last up of these easy examples, I've got 5 over 4. Well, real quick, hopefully I see that there's a bit of an issue here, because recall the domain is all the values between -1 and 1. And so if I try to, maybe I don't know that 5/4 is not between there, but if I divide this out, I see that 5/4 is really 1.25. That's not in my domain, and so this answer is actually undefined. I don't get an answer when I try to do this inverse trig function. Next up, let's take a look at what to do when the x value of the side ratio is negative. And it gets a little bit tricky here, so for right now, for this video, we're going to stick with just working with sine and tangent, inverse sine and inverse tangent. And the reason I'm picking just those two is because they have a particular set of answers I can get. This shaded circle down here shows where our different angles can come from when we're finding inverse sines and inverse tangents. We can either be up here in the positive quadrant, in quadrant 1 where all things are positive, or we could be down here in quadrant 4 where our side ratios are going to be negative. So let me show you how this will work for these two particular types of functions. So again, we're dealing just with inverse tangent and inverse sine right now. We'll save inverse cosine for the next video. So what we'll do when our angle is negative is first, or not our angle, when our side ratio is negative, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to just pretend that that's positive. Because when I go and look at my chart, I can see that in the tangent column, positive square root of 3 exists as an answer. And so when I read that backwards, I see that my angle is pi over 3. Well, it turns out that that pi over 3 is not really my answer, but it is my reference angle that I can use to finish this question. And so what I'm going to do, those shaded circles we just mentioned, what I'll do, and I'll give you a shortcut for this as well, is since my side ratio is actually negative, I need to draw that reference angle in the quadrant where tangent is negative, and that was this quadrant down here, back from those circles. So what I have is, if I draw that angle down there, that's really the angle we're talking about for this pi over 3. Well, the thing is, since I'm now measuring in a direction we're not used to measuring in, usually we measure counterclockwise around a circle to get a positive angle. Since we're measuring in a clockwise direction, what that means is this angle actually works out to be negative. So my final answer ends up being an angle of negative pi over 3. And so really the shortcut for these problems, at least for tangent and for sine, is if your side ratio is negative, that just means your angle is going to be negative. Okay, so let me show you these next two examples. We'll skip the the drawing portion of it, although that's why the answer works. We'll just use the shortcut for it. So again, this works for sine and inverse sine, inverse tangent. So let's go ahead and try inverse sine of negative square root of 2 over 2. I should check that it's in the domain. This one is in the domain. So I'll check my chart out. I'll see in the sine column, I get an angle of pi over 4. Which is really my reference angle, but since this side ratio is negative, the shortcut is we just make our angle negative. So our final answer will be negative pi over 4 for this. And then last up, I'm going to do the inverse sine of negative 1. And be careful on this one, because when you look down the sine column, you see there actually is a negative 1 in that column. But 3 pi over 2 isn't going to work. We're not allowed to go around that outside part of the circle to get to 3 pi over 2. So let's not break our plan. Let's just stick with what we've been doing. Pretend that your side ratio is positive and find that angle. So we'll pretend it was positive 1. My angle would then be pi over 2, but really that's just a reference angle. Since the side ratio is negative for inverse sine, we just go ahead and make our final angle negative. So my angle is going to be negative pi over 2. And as we mentioned, no, 3/2 or 3 pi over 2 doesn't work as an answer. The reason being, again, real quick, if I try to graph that angle, I'd have to go around in that direction, but we're not allowed to go there. Those shaded circles said we just have to stay on the right half of the circle. I'm not allowed to go around that other direction.